The last decade or so, we have certainly seen an increase in the interest of the game of soccer or football, if you are someone from Europe or another part of the world. And that has drawn a lot of attention on how the game is played, but how the athletes perform and the different dynamics that are in play that allow them to do the type of work that they do. Some research several years ago takes a look at the athlete and how they perform. And a pleasure to be joined by Michael Platt, who is a professor here at the Wharton School, who was part of the research and the lead on it. And he joins us right now. Michael, great to talk to you again. How are you, sir?
I'm great. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing very well. All right. So this was from a few years ago. Obviously, with the World Cup this year, this is going to draw even more attention. But let's go back in time and talk a little bit about what was it that drove you to want to learn about how athletes perform.
Yeah, so this is just a passion of mine in general. I mean, I'm a former, athlete, football, wrestling, baseball, and it's just I'm a junkie for all kinds of sports. But in addition, we believe that sports, that sort of high intensity, high pressure, you know, time is of the essence. The kinds of decisions that you have to make. That is a really good petri dish for understanding more about how all of us do those kinds of things, whether that's your business leader, working under pressure, under urgency, feeling like, things are uncertain and difficult, or just, somebody who's trying to navigate their day and, deal with their kids and, make lots of decisions, under pressure. So, it's, the other thing about soccer and sports in general is that, everything's quantified. So,
Mhm.
whereas, business outcomes often there's an indirect and sometimes nebulous path from the individual to the outcome that matters. And in sports, it's like, okay, how fast did you
Right.
run? Was your kick on target or not? How good were your passes?
And so, from your work that you've done over the years, you focus on the brain and the science of the brain. And when you're thinking about, at least with this study with athletics, there is probably quite a few components at play here in it, trying to understand how the brain functions and how that relates to the on field performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the untapped, unmeasured, hidden signal, really. So think about it from the perspective of American football. So one of the I think the best kind of case studies is Tom Brady, right? So he
Yeah.
falls to 199th in the draft, right? And arguably one, maybe the best quarterback of all time. So, why did that happen? And can we identify signals and traits that actually help us to do selection better, more scientifically, more quantitatively, and also then use that as a benchmark, if you will, or to help inform the training and development process.
How important then, right now, is that part of the science to the athletic performance in kind of sports in general right now? It seems like that teams look for more ways to better understand their athletes and their performance than ever before.
Absolutely. I mean, going back to Moneyball, which has had a major impact on baseball and other sports. There's just this, I think, recognition that there is a science to this, and quantitative, data-driven approaches have been incredibly effective. But it is an arms race, between between teams.
Yes.
You get a little advantage from bringing in some of these analytics, then another team does the same thing. So the way, kind of the perspective that we take is at this point, uh, often it's the case that everything from the neck down is
Yeah.
optimized, right? And pretty straightforward to measure. And so the differentiator is what's going on between the ears. So how fast do you process information? How good are
Right.
your decisions under pressure? How well do you recover from fatigue? What's your degree of focus? And the beauty of it is that now we can measure those things uh, quite readily without really being a burden on the athlete or on the team.
Right.
And we understand what they mean. And what we've done in that study and in others we can talk about is to connect the dots. Okay. And so we've uncovered what we will call three readiness signals in the brain that predict performance on the pitch, on the wrestling mat, on the baseball diamond, right? So a lot of these translate across sports, and many of those also translate into other kinds of jobs like
Yeah.
cybersecurity.
That was gonna be my next question is because I'm sure that this is research that probably has multiple layers to it in terms of where it can also be implemented in the business community as well.
Absolutely, and we take it as a model. Now, I feel pretty confident that the signals that we identified in the brain, as well as correlates that we can measure in sort of gamified assessments. So we've created a bunch of different little games that assess, like, how well you manage risk and return, or how good you are at kind of getting the gist of how many other players might be there, within your vicinity, or how
Right.
good you are at strategic thinking, getting inside the head of your opponent. So through a combination of those, we've been able to, yeah, absolutely demonstrate that what's true for a defender in soccer is true for a defender in cybersecurity and cyber ops in the military.
And that's great. What I also found interesting from this study, and as you have kind of alluded to already, is that there is the component of how the business reacts to this. And in the course of this study, it was the recommendations you gave to the Coventry City coaching staff and team in how they can kind of optimize this. And that's kind of the component that so many businesses are going through right now.
Absolutely. So with Coventry, it's Coventry City Football Club, which is a really interesting team because it's a mid-market to sort of low revenue team. So pretty much what they serve as is a development team for the big guys. And so once they've got a young player who shows a lot of talent, then they end up selling him on the market, and that's kind of how they keep going. So for them, it's really important to be able to identify talent before anybody else does. So somebody who's got the brain makeup, the mind makeup that otherwise doesn't appear through the eye test, right? So
Right.
like, which is sort of the most common approach that coaches and scouts take.
Are the kind of the dynamics that athletes show, are they fairly universal across athletes, or are there dynamics that are maybe slightly different depending on the person, who may be being scouted by a team?
Yeah, I mean, what we found is that these hidden signals in the brain, which the three that are most important that we've identified are focus. I'll just call it focus.
Yeah.
Another being confidence. So that's this is sort of data storytelling, but it's your brain's state of wanting to move forward, to go through that brick wall versus I don't want to be here, and then neural fatigue. So kind of how tired you are mentally, and it's often the case that people are unaware uh, of their brain states. That's pretty common, or they have difficulty verbalizing it, or they don't want to tell you, or they don't want to tell themselves. Like they're
Mhm.
like, you know, the pitcher on the mound in the ninth inning, who, he says like, I want to finish this game. I've been in the whole game, but maybe his brain is actually, a bit tired out. His focus is waning, and maybe overstating exactly how ready he is to continue.
As we move forward and the interest in and around the world of sports being so large right now, uh, that makes me think that these are components that not only can be looked at and looked for at the professional level, but
Yeah.
probably even in younger athletes as well. And I'm wondering if this is something that are these traits that are intrinsic within people, or are they developed, or how is it that you see this play out?
That is a $1 million or $100 million question. So we haven't really tested youth sports yet. Although in the Coventry study, their team included guys who were 16 on up to 35. So we were capturing actually a pretty significant window, since the brain doesn't stop developing until you're around 25 years old. So
Right.
half those guys were still in that developmental window. Um, I think that these are a combination of trait and state. So, and the reason I say that is that everything else we know about the brain and behavior, kind of like how you're wired, is about 50-50 nature and nurture. So, what you're born with, what you got from your parents, and then your experiences, and then how you develop. So, we don't want to
Right.
necessarily say, you can't be that,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, but for some players, for a specific position, let's say, the gap between where they are now, how they're wired,
Right.
and where they need to be to actually play at an elite level might be too far and they might be better suited to something else.
Well, and thinking about the world of soccer, there's a very big difference between how players play as an attack or an
Yes.
offensive player in comparison to how they play as a defender. Same probably in the game of hockey, and probably, as you kind
Right.
of alluded to, with some dynamics of different jobs within companies as well.
Exactly. That is one of the, I think, one of the really interesting, one of our most interesting findings from the Coventry study is that the kind of mental factors, the brain factors that make for a good defender are not exactly the same as what makes for a good attacker.
Right.
So, especially for defenders, the most important feature of how their brains process information is actually focus. So how good they are at attending to what's in front of them and maintaining that focus. And we actually used a measure, a derived measure that is, I wouldn't say it's diagnostic, but it's prognostic. So it kind of helps physicians understand whether somebody might have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And
Right.
some of the players that, I mean, there was a linear, just a smack dab linear relationship between this metric and actual defenders' performance on the field, and that performance was a measure is a composite of every single thing they do. So it's not just like steals and tackles, but positioning. And so it's a metric that's made up of many dozens of different measures. So that I think is some of those guys probably would qualify
Right.
for pharmacological treatment, insofar as that's actually allowed in sport.
Even though this was a few years ago, what did you take from doing this research, and how have you seen kind of the results you came to several years ago kind of play out and develop over the last handful of years?
Well, there's a few responses to that. I mean, one is, after we did our neuroprofiling study and we gave the coaches our report and recommendations, then Coventry won their league and then they were promoted uh, to premier. Of course, then they were relegated.
Relegated, yeah.
You're, but so we'll take full credit for that. No, I'm just joking. I mean, one of the things that we found is that, so of course, right after that, it was the pandemic. And so that kind of slowed things down quite a bit. There's a lot of interest, on the part of various sports, but they're very cautious. And the other thing I would say is that the market has kind of been spoiled by a lot of people selling snake oil. So saying that this is neuroscience, right, when there's no neuroscience in it, and
Mhm.
that it's going to work and it's going to deliver and it's going to be magic. So I spend a lot of my time kind of trying to rectify that, right, to inform the market and say, hey, this is real science, right? We developed it in the lab. We demonstrate that it works on the pitch, and now we've done that with baseball. We've done that with hockey, and wrestling. And we're actually so I think there's building momentum, and we're really excited because actually my startup Cogware, which is actually the technology that we used to measure these signals, a simple athletic headband that uh, measures with clinical grade accuracy brain activity. So we have a partnership are signed with the WBC, World Boxing Congress, Muay Thai. So we are going to be going in actually in 3 weeks to the Great Muay Thai Festival in Bangkok.
Oh,
There'll be
wow.
the fighters. I mean, this is going to be initially a pilot to measure these same hidden signals and then try to reverse engineer, not so much for selection, but for training. So then when you go back and look at training regimen, how many days off rest did you have, hydration, weight, what are you eating? And in that way, once we kind of connect all those dots, help each fighter to understand, like, how do I make sure that my brain is in the best state possible for a fight? And, not only is that really important for performance, but for safety as well. So if you go into that fight and you've got mental fatigue or you're lacking confidence, you could actually be injured.
Michael, always great to talk to you about your research. Thanks very much for a few moments today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Dan.
As always, Michael Platt, Wharton professor, joining us here on the show.